of Islamic ceramics, ancient Near East archaeological artifacts, and East Asian objects. She works for various museums in France, including Musée d'Orsay, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Musée d'Art Moderne de Troyes, and teaches at the French National Institute for Cultural Heritage. Before I hand it over to Claire, if people have questions, please type them into the chat, and we'll have 5 minutes at the end of her talk, and hopefully we can get to most of them, and if not all, Claire will have her email address at the end of the talk for people to send them any questions. So Claire, if you want to take over.
Thank you, Gina. So hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this presentation as part of WCJ's Tonight Circus. I would like to start by thanking everyone at the Washington Conservation Guild who worked to make this evening of presentations possible. So today I'm speaking to you from Paris, but when I was a member of WCG a few years ago, I used to live in Washington, DC, which is part of the unceded land of the Nacotchtank people. And I apologize for my pronunciation. So I would like to acknowledge the Nacotchtank community and pay my respects to their past, present, and future elders. Sorry. So my talk today will present a project I conducted last September in Beirut, in Lebanon. And more specifically at the American University of Beirut's Archaeological Museum, which was founded in 1868, which makes it the third oldest museum in the Near East. And I assume you have all heard and read about the blast that took place after a fire at a pier in the port of Beirut on August 4th. It caused the death of over 200 people. Thousands were injured and lost their homes. And they're still suffering from this very severe crisis. And several museums and historical buildings in Beirut were also affected by the explosion. And about 2.6 miles away at AUB Archaeological Museum, all windows and the main door were blown by the blast. Broken glass was scattered in exhibition spaces. All objects in vitrines came out unscathed, unfortunately, except for one glass case that toppled over and fell face down onto the marble floor. This vitrine used to present 74 glass objects dating from Phoenician, Roman, and Islamic periods, such as vases, bottles, bowls, plates, and a mosque lamp. As you can probably see, almost all of them show some level of degradation and iridescence. And the wall painting that you can see on the right is a photograph, so I didn't have to deal with stucco fragments. So in the immediate aftermath of the blast, the museum director, Ms. Nadine Panayot, contacted the Institut National du Patrimoine in Paris, which is the French National Institute for Cultural Heritage, and one of the 4 programs that trains art conservators in France. Ms. Panayot was already building a partnership with the Institute before the blast for training Lebanese heritage professionals. So within a few days, the National Institute for Cultural Heritage, acting as a representative of the French Ministry of Culture, put together an emergency project and received funding from ALIF, the International Alliance for the Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas. And this funding is part of a greater $5 million envelope for Beirut's cultural heritage. and it covered sending a conservator to Beirut for 4 days, as well as conservation supplies. The National Institute for Cultural Heritage then contacted me, and we started ordering the supplies that would be necessary to the recovery project and planning for it. Then the state of the COVID-19 pandemic in Lebanon worsened, and the country was placed under a lockdown, which delayed the beginning of the recovery project by almost 2 weeks. It also made it necessary for me to stay isolated in my hotel room for another 48 hours after my arrival in Beirut. And I finally flew to Lebanon on September 4, 1 full month after the blast, while the country was still under a curfew. While windows were being replaced and broken window glass was swept from galleries, the toppled case had been left in place until then, and it was lifted just before I arrived at the museum by museum staff under the supervision of the museum director and an engineer that you can see on the photograph. And this step did not cause further breakage or move any glass shard. And this is what it looked like when I arrived and started with recovery work. So broken glass objects and sherds mixed with broken modern glass from the vitrine and the heavy glass shelves. So recovery was done as teamwork with the museum director, museum staff, and some volunteers, most of them museology and archaeology students. We started by setting up our workspace in the gallery next to the one in which the fallen case was located. A laptop with the museum collection database was used for identification of the objects, and another space was dedicated to consolidation treatments. Conservation grade boxes were lined with thin plastazote foam, all of which was part of the supplies I brought with me on the plane. Along with paraloid B72, gloves, face masks, acid-free tissue paper, some small tools, Ziploc bags, etc. And then we were ready to start the recovery itself. So one of my main worries was the condition of the glass sherds. All of the objects showed chemical degradation with iridescent upper layers, delamination and lifting, and some hairline cracks. And another was how to identify sherds that were mixed up and scattered across a relatively wide area. So I found that it would be best to pick up sherds on the floor methodically and systematically, area by area, rather than jumping to recognizable larger sherds and forgetting smaller ones, which later would be more difficult to link to other sherds. So thinking of the way archaeological excavations are organized, I divided the gallery floor into 5 areas so that we could pick all of the sherds from one area, even the smallest ones, before moving on to the next. I also set a few roles for everyone helping on the recovery, since although most of them had an archaeology background, none of them were really trained in preventive conservation and art handling best practices. So, I mean, those roles will seem very basic, but handling of the fragments is to be reduced as much as possible, and handling the boxes is preferred. Nitrile gloves must be worn at all times to handle sherds, rather than cotton gloves or bare hands. Objects and fragments should be kept in conservation grade boxes lined with plastazote foam to prevent them from moving and rolling around in the box. They should be placed in the box in a single layer and spaced out as much as possible. And boxes should be stored closed to avoid dust. And finally, they should be handled using both hands. Then the following method was developed for picking the sherds off the floor and separating them into different boxes. So when fragments could be recognized on the floor as being part of the same vessel, so using the glass color, the sherd's curvature and thickness, and the surface appearance and condition, as well as the type of degradation and iridescence. They were collected and placed together in a box, such as the one on the lower right. So these single object boxes were marked with the object's inventory number as soon as the fragments could be matched with an object in the database. Then when sherds were mixed up and difficult to sort out or recognize, they were placed together in a box to prevent the loss of any information about their location on the gallery floor. The area boxes created this way are identified according to the piece's location and are meant to serve as a stock of sherd, if I may, from which to look for fragments matching other objects. And finally, single object boxes are also identified with the location of the fragments on the floor. And this is done to help finding missing sherds in nearby area boxes later. So while sherds were being picked up from the floor, fragments were identified by comparing them with the AUB Archaeological Museum collection database. Identification was mostly done by the museum's research assistants, who are trained archaeologists and know the collections well. I also consolidated the most unstable fragments that showed either iridescent and lifting layers or hairline cracks. Both surface and structural consolidation were done using dilute B72 in a mix of acetone and ethanol. Part of the recovery operation, parts of the recovery operation were broadcast on Facebook through Facebook Lives. And more generally, AUB wanted to give our operation visibility on social media through Facebook Lives and posts with photographs in order to keep followers up to date on our progress. And I have to say that although this was an added source of stress for me, they created some momentum and quite a few people were interested and actively followed what we were doing. And here you can see part of the team picking up sherds. And I hope it gives you a sense of the size of some of the fragments, even the smallest ones. And also the amount of modern glass mixed in that we had to separate out. So at the end of the fourth and last day of the recovery operation, we had been able to pick up all of the sherds from the gallery and to identify fragments of 73 objects out of the 74 that were present in the vitrine. 2 glass vessels had been found whole and unbroken, which was both a surprise and a relief for the whole team. And a third object showed a couple small losses and a crack, but was still mostly complete. Then a general assessment of the condition of the fragments was done. About 15 objects were identified as a priority for future conservation treatment because they were more complete and easier to put back together. The photographs on the right of the screen show some of these priority objects, along with their before the blast picture from the database. So each object or group of fragments was assessed and assigned one of 3 levels of fragility. So 49 were found to be fragile, 19 were very fragile, and 5 were noted as extremely fragile and not to be handled unless necessary. For the next steps of the recovery work, the museum staff have a great amount of puzzle work ahead of them that needs to be done in order to prepare for potential conservation treatments and to make them possible. Preventive conservation measures were recommended in order to avoid dust accumulation, surface losses, or additional breakage. And 2 sets of priority were outlined. One for the museum staff indicated which objects and area boxes to work on first to advance the puzzle. And the second set of priorities regarded future conservation treatments and selected objects for which conservation work would be the most beneficial. That is, objects that were less fragmentary and or showed less losses. As for AUB, they have launched a fundraiser and have been sharing about the recovery efforts on social media. And in addition to the funding from ALIF that allowed for this operation, a few international institutions had offered to help AUB Archaeological Museum with the recovery and treatment of the objects at the time of the blast. So this might be another possibility. But as far as I know, funding for treating the objects has not been secured yet. And I hope it will make it possible for the museum to exhibit these pieces again in a somewhat near future. So I would like to thank AUB and its staff for their warm welcome and their kindness. The National Institute for Cultural Heritage for the organization and logistics of this operation, and ALIF for their support and fast response. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have some. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. I can't even imagine undertaking a task like that, and that's so many pieces of what had been so many complete objects. It's so sad to come upon, but lucky that you could be there.
Thank you.
I actually had a question thinking about, traveling to another country to do something like that and having to pack materials that you'll need. What was that like, and having to think about maybe limited space, what you can bring, what you can't bring, not knowing really what you need?
Thank you. Actually, yes, this was one of the first difficulties, as trying to bring enough supplies, like enough to everything that could be useful, and at the same time I was limited by the type of supplies that I could bring. So fortunately the museum was able to get a few solvents, which were not possible to take on a plane, obviously. But then it was a matter of how many boxes would I need, and I thought, taking more than the number of objects that we were expecting to find would hopefully be enough, and it was not nearly enough.
Yeah.
And also that took place in August, and traditionally August is extremely quiet in France. And so at first I wasn't even sure that vendors would be available. But thankfully they were extremely reactive, and they even offered some discounts in support to the operation and to Lebanon, given what they were going through.
Yeah. Were they having difficulties acquiring materials because of it affecting so many areas?
True. Yes, absolutely. So Lebanon, on top of the blast and the pandemic, had been going through a political and economical very severe crisis since over a year ago. And so their money isn't worth anything anymore.
Okay.
Prices are going up and up extremely quickly, and their salaries are not. And so a number of supplies just cannot be found in Lebanon. And even if they could be found, they don't have the money to buy it. So actually the museum director was extremely happy that I brought her some cotton gloves, although they weren't to be used on that project because she could not find any. So, I mean, any supplies really were welcome too, in addition to what we needed for the project.
I have a question here asking about who were the museum staff you were working with, and how big of a museum was it, or is it? And there's also just a mention of your WCG apron in the photo you have over there.
So the team that you see on this last photo is actually really the museum staff. The only additional staff is an admin assistant. So it's the museum curator and director and 4 research assistants. And we had, depending on which day of the operation, between 2 and 4 volunteers. One of them was the former museum director, and the others were students. And I mean, it was great having people help because there was so much work, but at the same time, you've seen the slide, the photo where several people are kneeling near the pile of broken glass, and it's really, we couldn't be more than 3 or 4 picking up sherds at a time. And so quickly we sort of organized ourselves sort of spontaneously. Some people started advancing the puzzle work, and others were picking up sherds, and some were doing the identification. So it sort of worked like this, but yeah, it was both difficult because I was the only trained conservator working on the project, but I couldn't have done it without all the help.
And there are other questions, but time for one last question. What was the most challenging aspect of the recovery process?
There were several. I mean, the time constraint, I could have used another week easily, and I wish I had more time to consolidate more fragments. I think stress and, you know, having to, I just had to make sure that everything was picked up by the 4th day. And I also did not know what the damage was like until I arrived in Lebanon, since the case had not been lifted. So it was hard planning for it. Yeah. And then finally having people shooting Facebook Lives while you're working and figuring out what is the best way to start is really difficult, but it ended up working out. And I think it really made the museum staff and students and people following it feel better at that time. So it was important.
Thank you. Just a reminder to the people who we've run out of time for questions that Claire's email address is on her last slide. So please feel free to reach out to her with your questions. Claire, thank you so much. Virtual round of applause.
Teresa is a postdoctorate fellow at the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute. She earned her PhD in chemistry at Georgetown University, where she studied gels used for cleaning applications. She's currently researching soot removal from surfaces. And tonight, we want to please welcome Teresa Duncan as she speaks to us about the virtual fellowship, practical methods for conducting hands-on conservation research at home. Teresa, do you want to take over and share your screen from here?
Absolutely. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for the introduction. I'd also like to thank the organizers for planning this pair of evenings. And I'd like to note that I am speaking to you today from Arlington, Virginia, which is part of the unceded land of the Nacotch Tank, who I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to. Tonight, I will be presenting my experience with a virtual fellowship, which was originally planned as an on-site one. I'd like to begin by introducing my background. I obtained my PhD under the direction of Dick Weiss, a chemistry professor at Georgetown University, and Barbara Berry, a scientist at the National Gallery of Art, and we explored the use of organogels and hydrogels for cleaning applications, specifically the removal of varnishes from surfaces, as well as the removal of grime. I explored this concept of grime removal further at NIST for a 2-year postdoc, where I worked with Kate Beers, a polymer chemist, and Edwin Chan, an adhesion scientist. And we further explored how elastomers and gels and these types of soft materials can be used to remove particulates from interfaces. We were particularly interested in the adhesion that forms between soft materials and these particulates. So then I was trying to figure out my next steps, and I decided I really wanted to obtain another postdoc position, and I wanted to work more directly with art conservators. But I also wanted to build on this research foundation that I had already established. So I decided I really wanted to write my own proposal, because this is something I had done for my postdoc at NIST, and it really allowed me to tailor my research to my own interests. So I discovered the Smithsonian Postgraduate Postdoctoral Fellowship in Conservation of Museum Collections and decided I wanted to apply, but first I needed an area of study. So this was mid-2019, and in April I was inspired, arguably in the worst way, as I joined the world watching Notre Dame on fire. And we all know this is not the first or last time that one of these events has occurred. This slide shows a sliver of a fraction of these kinds of events through history. And in some cases, the damage is catastrophic to collections, but in other cases, a portion or sometimes the entire collection can be conserved. But conservators have to deal with water damage and molds as well as soot. And I became particularly interested in soot because I was wondering if my experience working with removing solid particulates from interfaces could be an area that could be further explored and could benefit the community. So I decided to apply for a postdoc to work at MCI, the Museum Conservation Institute, and I wanted to explore the use of different materials for removing soot from surfaces. And I really wanted to work with Shannon Brogdon-Grantham, who is a paper and photo conservator at MCI. She had explored the use of some different solvents for removing soot from photographs in grad school. And I also wanted to work with Ed Vicenzi, who is a research scientist at MCI and has a lot of experience in microscopy, which I thought could really benefit an analysis of these substrates before and after cleaning. So this brings us to the proposal as it was originally written pre-coronavirus. And we wanted to explore the removal of soot from model substrates relevant to archival heritage. To do this, I was planning to use wet and dry cleaning methods as listed below to remove soot from a range of substrates also listed below. The planned output was to produce a cleaning survey. This would rely heavily on the use of a colorimeter to measure the color of these surfaces with cleaning and correlate this with the cleaning efficacy. I was particularly interested to see how cleaning efficacy would depend on substrate properties. So specifically, this would be comparing the chemistry of these films, but also to correlate this with surface roughness. So this might be comparing the gelatin film to the gelatin-sized paper to see how roughness affects cleaning. I wanted to follow this up with a scientific investigation using optical microscopy and scanning electron microscopy to really better understand this cleaning interaction with the different substrates. I guess what I mean here is we wanted to see if some of these methods would just remove soot from the topmost portions of the substrate, or if these methods were really able to clean inside all the nooks and crannies of a rough surface. And Secondly, we wanted to see what physical changes might occur to the substrate upon cleaning. So specifically what I mean here is, do we see indications of damage or residue left on the surface from these cleaning methods? So this proposal was accepted. I was notified, I believe, on March 4th of 2020, and it was days later that the local museums began to close their doors to the public. At this point, Ed and Shannon reached out to me and indicated they wanted me to rewrite my proposal or write a new proposal that could be done 100% from home. So at first this seemed kind of overwhelming, but upon thinking of this proposal a little more, it seemed like a lot of aspects here could be done from home. So these are the changes I made. First of all, I decided to maximize the use of commercially available materials. For instance, here, I didn't want to work with any solvents, organic solvents at home. And I also decided, at least for now, to put agarose hydrogels and any other hydrogels on the back burner. I am a gel chemist. I really want to explore these kinds of materials for soot removal, but I didn't want to prioritize them to begin this project. I wanted to start with kind of ready to go materials and substrates to just simplify the project and then slowly add complexity as the project is hopefully successful. And this is just kind of to minimize the chance that I face too many obstacles along the way. Because of this, have been able to add a lot more methods to the survey. So I think this is a huge benefit. I've added 3 erasers, eraser crumbs, a Wishab dry cleaning sponge, and some other methods. So hopefully I can look at a more expansive list of materials for cleaning. I decided to simplify the sample prep. This is due to the fact that I would not be able to work side by side with Shannon in producing these films, and decided instead to focus on gelatin-sized watercolor paper, which comes in different roughnesses, so I would still be able to explore the effect of roughness with cleaning. And then I found that a lot of aspects here I could still pursue. So a cleaning survey won't be a problem because I've been able to borrow a colorimeter from MCI. And in terms of the scientific investigation, I was also able to borrow a USB microscope from Ed. And I should be able to acquire some scanning electron microscopy images with the help of MCI staff. As it stands now, fellows are not allowed on site at MCI, but staff do have limited access. So hopefully I will still be able to get a lot of the information that I was originally seeking. So I would now like to take you on a tour of my home lab. This is a layout of my basement, which does in fact have a lot of walls. My favorite design feature, and by favorite, I really do mean least favorite, is this fireplace, which has been boarded up and a wall has been built perpendicularly down the middle of it to create this windowless room. As it turns out, this windowless room is the perfect photo documentation studio. So that's where I decided to set up all of my tools. Here I have my photo documentation set up. Here's my USB microscope. And then over here, I have my wet lab, which consists of a microwave. And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I will say that this is really all I need to make the hydrogels that I hope to eventually make. So I do want to show the kind of information that I can get with these tools. I've so far accomplished some preliminary tests and prepared some samples. Here is the paper before coating with any soot. Then I coated this paper with soot and experimented with some different cleaning methods. And you can see in these 3 bottommost images collected with the microscope that they do provide a lot of information for this cleaning action. Here we have the paper beforehand, after coating with soot, and then this is dabbing with a soot sponge. And you can really see the areas that have been cleaned and the ones that have not. So some general tips I have for performing this kind of research from home. The first facet that made kind of reshaping this proposal easier was that my funding was very flexible. To write the proposal, I had to write a budget, and I allocated a certain amount of money for research travel to attend a conference. But I won't be traveling anytime soon, so I decided and was able to put that money towards materials, and I was able to order them and ship them directly to my home, so that in October, when I started this fellowship, I was really able to get started right away. I also recommend to kind of maximize accomplishments along the way, to set a series of small goals and work off that, and just start simply and add complexity. That's definitely helped me kind of navigate this new experimental world from my home. In terms of materials, I recommend minimizing sample preparation and relying on commercially available model materials, again, just to simplify all your procedures. And in terms of instrumentation, I hope I've started to show you that some of these in-home tools that I'm using can provide a lot of information. And also, I recommend not hesitating to ask scientists for help. And I'm sure this goes the same for conservators. Scientists and conservators, for the most part, have worked as interns or fellows, or have been on temporary contract at some point in their lives. So I think they understand working within a limited time window, and genuinely want to help fellows along the way. I do want to specifically call out safety, because it has been somewhat difficult, right, to establish a safety culture of one when you're just one person. So here I recommend hold yourself accountable. I think a good way to do this is to utilize the expertise of safety officers and other staff. I recommend walking through your intended procedures with other people. It's always good to have another mind on a protocol to ensure that you are acting in the safest way possible. And I also recommend prioritizing the minimization of risk. My example here is that I've been working outside wearing an N95 mask to coat lamp black on my different papers. That's my model soot. And obviously this is not ideal, because I cannot regulate the temperature and humidity of the outdoors. However, I do minimize the risk of circulating lamp black through my workspace and through my home, because I really want to keep my family and myself safe. So in conclusion, at home hands-on research can be performed. I hope that I've shown that through this presentation. I recommend relying on commercially available materials, model substrates, the expertise of virtual colleagues, and portable and or affordable tools. Please do consider safety protocols, and also consider virtual networking opportunities like this. It was very different to start a position virtually. I think it's difficult to build those kinds of relationships with other people when you're not working side by side with them that would be ideal for a fellowship like this. However, there are a lot of virtual tools that you can use to help in this area. And to that extent, please do email me if you're a conservator, a scientist, and you don't have the access to the lab space that you would like to have, and you think that this idea could work for you. Please reach out to me. Or if perhaps a fellow could work with you to do something similar, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd love to provide any kind of feedback or insight or observations I've made along the way. Also, if you are a conservator and you have worked with soot before, I would love to learn about the materials that you used and any observations you found along the way. I really want to ensure that this project and its results are as helpful as possible to the conservation community. So your feedback would really be super valuable. So I'd like to thank, of course, the Smithsonian for funding this fellowship, as well as my advisors, Shannon and Ed. I'd also like to thank really all MCI staff, but I'd like to call out Nicole Little, our safety officer, Paula DePriest, our deputy director, who helped get me set up with teleworking tools, and Keats Webb, our imaging specialist, who helped with my photo documentation setup. And I'd also like to thank Edwin, Marcos, Barbara, and Renata, who all in some way have helped with materials or measurements so far. So lastly, I would love to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Teresa. We appreciate that. And we appreciate your ingenuity and your creativity in creating a home program. That couldn't have been easy every step of the way. We do have a couple of questions for you. Most of them regard the soot. We have a question about how are you simulating or generating the soot that you coated your samples with?
Yeah, so I am working with lamp black pigment. It's a black pigment produced mostly from oils and fats, I think, and it produces this kind of oily soot. So I've been coating that on papers kind of by just using an old takeout container and taping my paper to the bottom of it, and then adding soot and just kind of shaking it around to mimic a distribution that might be produced from kind of air flowing around and depositing soot. I've experimented with a lot of different ways to deposit the soot, and so far this has been the one that I think has best mimicked what I've seen from deposition from an actual fire. In that case, I should point out that Renata, who's listed on this last slide, is an artist who experienced a house fire. So she gave me a few materials that she had, which were book covers coated with soot, and I was able to look at those under the microscope and try to experiment with different methods to replicate a deposition that looked most similar to what would happen in a house fire.
Okay, so that's part of the next question too that someone had about how would you characterize the soot and compare it to like what you'd find when materials are burned in a fire. So it sounds like you were comparing it to the artist materials that actually were in a fire then.
Yes, yes.
Are you considering, another question is, are you considering writing up this experience for AIC News or another publication to inspire pre-program and other students?
I've not considered that. I would certainly be interested in it. And if there's, someone I can reach out to more, I'd love to contribute, because I think, I mean, so far, I imagine there are a lot of conservators and scientists who are in my position and trying to figure out how to do a fellowship remotely, and I think this is one good possible path.
So there seems to be yet another question about the characterization of this, or maybe the application of it. Here's one asking, how does Teresa coat the papers? Does she use a binder?
No, I don't use a binder. I just use the paper and soot and then place them in a container together and shake them around. And I realize it's not the most sophisticated technology to deposit my soot, but I will say that it does seem to distribute in a way that is similar to what would find after a house fire, which is pretty much consists of a very even distribution of small particles, but then also some do aggregate along the surface. So I see both of those present, which I think is important for then cleaning and assessing kind of how this cleaning might clean or remove some types of aggregates, but not single particles and things like that.
Well, one more question about your application of soot. Wondering if you were not at home, if you were back in a lab, how would your application be different, the application of the soot itself to your samples?
That's a good question. I will say that the way I had originally planned to deposit soot didn't work when I tried it in my backyard. So I imagine I would have just continued trying different methods until I found something that worked. So I don't know. I don't know if in the end it would be all that different. It could be I would use the same method, but I would do it in a fume hood to minimize risk instead of doing it outside. So then at least I would be able to control temperature and humidity. But I will say so far I'm pretty happy with the final product. So in the end, maybe my my method in a lab would have been kind of similar.
Well, we have one suggestion from Sue Donovan, who said that you could possibly maybe reach out to insurance companies that have dealt with house fires, and you might be able to actually have, you might actually be able to obtain objects to work on or something like that. Or...
Yeah, that's a great idea. I was very happy to get in touch with that artist who had that house fire, and I'm sure there are other sites like that. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much tonight. We want to thank all of our speakers. We are getting low on time here, and Teresa has put her email or her contact information in the presentation, so please use it. And we want to thank all of our speakers, Yadine, Claire, Miguel, Teresa, thank you all. And we will be here again on Wednesday the 13th for the second tent in our virtual 2-ring tent circus. Thank you all for coming, and unless anyone has any more comments, we'll see you next week.
I just have one little bit of business, just in case people didn't realize, RSVP for, there's a different link for the second night, so please RSVP for that if you're a non-member, and that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. Good catch. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.